Good evening and welcome to this series about all our futures, about what our economic and political landscape will look like 10 years or more from now. This week, Arthur Scargill, President of the National Union of Mine Workers, sets out to answer the question, has British capitalism a future a decade hence? He'll outline his views on how economic and other pressures are going to bring about a fundamental change in the nature of our society. Listening to him and questioning his ideas are Jack Wiseman, Professor of Economics at York University and a member of the right-wing research group, the Institute of Economic Affairs. Dr. Patricia Hollis, a lecturer in history and an active member of the Labour Party. In these times of fine political distinction, she might be placed on the soft left. And Robert Rhodes James MP, historian and Conservative member for Cambridge, who describes himself as a progressive liberal Conservative. Make of that what you will. 10 years ago, Arthur Scargill was still a coal-faced worker down a Yorkshire pit. Now, at 44, he's been president of the NUM for 6 months and was elected by secret ballot to lead Britain's 250,000 miners. He rightly claims to be the first real socialist to hold that office. Certainly, the more right-wing press portrays King Arthur as far on the left and recalls his youthful membership of the Communist Party and his arrest on the Grunwick picket line.
I think there could be real problems in the coalfield unless we get together and sort this matter out.
Much has been made of his contacts with Cuba and Eastern Europe, but Arthur Scargill believes that internationalism is part of socialism.
And if you think that you've got problems in Germany, all you have to do is to look at our newspapers and read about Mrs. Thatcher, and you'll be thankful that you live in Germany.
He's strongly anti-nuclear and anti-common market, and he's one of the leading campaigners against the government's economic policy and trade union legislation. Arthur Scargill is due to remain president of the NUM until 2002, so he'll be at a good vantage point to watch the changes he envisages between now and the end of the century. Arthur Scargill.
Britain is facing the worst economic crisis in its history. It is a crisis which could lead to the creation of a socialist society. Or alternatively, we could see the establishment of an ultra-right neo-fascist state. Let me begin by presenting you with two visions of life in future Britain. We've moved on 15 years, and it's now 1997. The first vision is a nation still controlled by capitalism. Starved of investment in an unplanned free market economy, British industry has totally collapsed. Too late, the government has reluctantly levied import controls and withdrawn from the European common market. It has now taken steps to try and rejuvenate a dying economy and system. But these palliatives are no longer of any assistance. Mass unemployment, now accepted as inevitable and incurable, has led to a substantial increase in premature deaths, mental illness and overflowing prisons. Social unrest and civil violence have been intensified, especially amongst the young and the ethnic minorities. Continual cuts in public expenditure have seen a breakdown in the education system and a total collapse of the social services. Increased homelessness has added to tension and despair. As far as the health service is concerned, the cutbacks in public expenditure have secured the establishment of two completely separate levels of medical care. One private, along the lines of that operating in the United States today, and the other a mere shadow of the former National Health Service, providing treatment more in line with the resources of the 19th century. In such a climate, racial violence has intensified, and our police force has now become a paramilitary organization, nakedly defending the capitalist system. It is a society without hope, degraded and debased, and there is a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. I submit that if you look at Britain today, you can already see a picture of what it will be like in 15 years' time. There is, of course, an alternative. The second vision that I have is of a socialist Britain, in which people own and control the means of production, distribution and exchange, and in essence control their own destiny. It is a society which devotes its energies to peace and growth, not to war and destruction, to people and not profits, and to the creation of conditions where internationalism becomes synonymous with nationalism. It has as its centre total accountability, and this includes common ownership of radio, television and the press, all which are currently owned by people or groups with a vested interest in the preservation of the existing capitalist state. It is a society which fully exploits its natural resources. It utilizes our self-sufficiency in energy and creates the conditions for self-sufficiency in food. It develops to the full the technical abilities of our people, and it leads to a continuing increase in our standard of life. We see the establishment of a 4-day working week with no loss of pay, and the creation in a number of major industries of a 3-day working week. It is a society which begins to develop the latent talents of our people in the cultural sense. Our education system, under this new society, encourages and inspires young people to fully participate in music and drama, the visual and creative arts. Society's profits are reinvested in a commonly shared production of wealth. Production, based on the full range of our material needs, provides guaranteed full employment. No section will be excluded from this society. It will be based on sharing and caring for each other. Health, social services, education and housing will be its top priorities. And military expenditure will be cut to the bone, as this new society places its emphasis on peace rather than war. My vision of a socialist Britain would demand and lead a crusade for a peaceful world, in order that military spending on a national and indeed on an international scale would become a thing of the past. We would be free of nuclear bases and weapons, and play our full part in helping to persuade the superpowers to dismantle their arsenals and save our planet and our people from ultimate destruction. Given this sort of system, our nation's economic position can be transformed. These two visions are not merely issues to be debated in the academic sense. The British people have to make a choice. And I submit that if we really care about our people, we have only one option: to create a socialist society capable of fulfilling the aspirations of ordinary people. Capitalism has no solution to the current crisis, and the actions of our present government will only continue to exacerbate the current situation. I offer as evidence in support of my argument for a socialist system of society the present economic crisis and the blatant contradictions of capitalism. It is necessary to understand that capitalism's motivation is a free market economy and the acquisition of maximum profit. While the capitalist system prospered in the 19th century, workers starved and diseases previously unknown in Britain reached epidemic proportions. This inevitably exposed the inherent contradiction of capitalism. Workers on subsistent rates of wages could not afford, as a result of their purchasing power, to buy the goods that they'd already produced. Without a market for these goods, there can be no profit, since goods are essentially produced for sale and not for consumption. In the 19th century, Britain's expertise in manufacturing gave her a dominance in world trade, although as other European competitors, such as France and Germany, began to develop their industries, using incidentally more modern and efficient techniques, they established themselves in the export markets, which had previously been the exclusive province of the British. The basic contradiction in capitalist society was seen in the 1920s, in the full-scale slump which followed the United States stock market crash in 1929, and in the period leading up to the Second World War. Only direct government intervention through the rearmament program in the 1930s put an end to that slump. Then, as now, politicians denied that resources were available to improve housing, health or education, but they quickly found resources when they needed to build weapons of mass destruction. Following the end of the Second World War, Britain was able to share in the post-war boom, and for a time, full employment was maintained along with economic growth, albeit at a lower rate than that of our competitors. This time, however, Britain's relative decline was not confined to a loss of export markets. Our share in the home market began to suffer as imports of foreign manufacturers began to gain in volume and significance. There were those who came to believe that full employment would always be maintained. But the inherent contradictions of capitalism was hopelessly exposed when the post-war boom came to an end and unemployment began to accelerate as deindustrialization swept the nation. But all that we had previously experienced pales into insignificance alongside the devastation wreaked by the present government over the past 3 years. In the 2 years following the election of Mrs. Thatcher's government, industrial production has dropped by 12%, manufacturing output by 14%, and investment in manufacturing industry has fallen by 25%. The government's reaction and its strategy in the face of this crisis is perhaps predictable, but terrifying nonetheless. What is happening is that capitalism is now in its final crisis. What the government is doing is throwing up a few sandbags in a desperate attempt to try and stop the tide of history. It cannot succeed, and it will only make the situation worse. During the last 2.5 years, 23,000 companies have gone into liquidation, and registered unemployment has reached its highest ever level of 3.2 million, or a rise of 150% since 1979. The official figures, however, hide the true extent of unemployment. When we take into account those actually seeking part-time work, who are not included in the statistics, married women and others who fail to register, but who would work if it was available, and those on special employment schemes sponsored by the government, the real level of unemployment is probably approaching 5 million, or nearly 20% of the working population. If measures are not taken immediately to deal with the present acute crisis, I firmly believe that unemployment will reach 6 to 8 million towards the end of the century. New technology will inevitably be used to create unemployment. Already, certain employers are talking about technological unemployment, as though it's an acceptable concept. In this crisis, young people, black workers and women, particularly those in lower paid jobs, have been amongst those who have been severely hit. Instead of taking steps to rejuvenate the economy, the government's response has been to penalise the unemployed by cutting benefits and welfare services. The lunar landscape you see in Britain today has been produced by a capitalist system which finds itself in acute crisis. But the actions taken by the government will only make the situation worse, creating conditions which will lead to the early demise of the system. The government has deliberately increased unemployment, cut back on public expenditure, introduced cash limits policies for nationalised industries, and introduced anti-trade union legislation to prevent organised mass opposition to its policies. The government believes that the twin effects of high unemployment and anti-trade union legislation will blackmail workers into accepting a loss of jobs, a reduction in real wages, and the elimination of social services. Unemployment is wasteful both in the economic and human sense. The overall costs for maintaining unemployment are as high as 14 billion. Last year, our house building program was the lowest for 50 years, and yet we have 370,000 construction workers unemployed. This is a clear example of how capitalism cannot match the needs to resources. Another example is our defence budget, now running at over 14,000 million pounds, with another 7,500 million to be spent on Trident missiles. And in April, we embarked on the Falklands fiasco, which in addition to seeing the slaughter of British and Argentinians, cost over 2,000 million pounds. In July, the government announced another 1,200 million pound increase in spending on weapons and military equipment. Yet, with all this taking place, they can only provide 90 million pounds for the nurses and National Health Service workers. The money spent on Trident missiles alone would pay for 13 new hospitals, 1,000 new kidney machines, 100 new schools, the complete electrification of British Rail, and still leave enough over to meet the current minus pay claim in full. In spite of these appalling statistics and comparisons, in spite of the current crisis, the government continue to preach the gospel of free enterprise and monetarism. The crisis is blamed on world economic conditions, without any mention of how these conditions occurred in the first place. A favourite ploy of the government is to blame nationalisation for many of our economic difficulties, without any recognition of the economic facts. When the government argue that nationalisation doesn't work and is inefficient when compared with private enterprise, they actually distort the truth. Mrs. Thatcher's government has, in fact, been singing the praises of nationalisation for 3 years. But significantly, the media have never exposed the hypocrisy of what this government say or do. The Tory government have applauded the nationalised armed forces as the most effective and efficient in the world. They are continually singing the praises of our nationalised police force, our judicial system, or should I say, their judicial system, and various national and municipal departments who work in the interests of the capitalist state. In conclusion, I submit that free enterprise based on exploitation produces waste and decay and cannot hope to survive. There is no moral or political justification for its continuation, and there are very powerful arguments for it to be overthrown before its own inevitable collapse. We could, of course, in the short term, alleviate the difficulties and help capitalism continue, albeit for a short time. To do this, public expenditure would have to be substantially increased, particularly in health, education, housing and the social services. The defence budget would have to be reduced by at least 50%, thus freeing £8,000 million to be utilised to reflate the economy. We would have to withdraw from the European Common Market and give subsidies to British industry in line with those applicable to the capitalist West and communist East. We would have to introduce import controls. But these would only be palliatives. They would only serve to postpone the day when capitalism would inevitably collapse. The long-term solution is the establishment of a socialist society. I will not and cannot seek to justify socialism on the basis of the mistakes made in countries which profess to have a socialist system. In the same way, I would not seek to justify or uphold Christianity on the basis of the terror and slaughter performed so often in its name. I want to see an end to injustice and inequality, the elimination of war, and the creation of a more compassionate and caring system which puts people before profit. I want to see socialism, not simply because it will bring an end to the recurring crisis of capitalism, but because it will build a system capable of fulfilling the highest hopes and aspirations of mankind.
Arthur Scargill, thank you very much indeed. I'd just like to ask you one question in clarification of something that you said towards the end of your lecture. You said there's no moral or political justification for the free enterprise system, and there are powerful arguments for it to be overthrown before its own inevitable collapse. What do you mean by overthrown?
I mean that we have to examine the bringing together the collective organizations and bodies within society that will establish, through a general election, the conditions necessary to completely dismantle capitalism and establish socialism.
So it would be a democratic process?
Of course it would, but it would be a fundamental change from Labour governments that have accepted the inevitable continuation of capitalism and merely tinkered at the edges of the system.
Jack Wiseman, can we have some general comments from you about what Mr. Scargill's been saying?
Well, the first thing is that I don't really accept Mr. Scargill's interpretation of history, and even more, I don't accept his interpretation of the current situation. Further, I think what he's given us is a vision of the future as a sort of continuation of the present, to which most of his attention has been given, and an assertion, which has very little support in what he said, that socialism will be better in the future. There's no serious examination of how things would in fact be done in his optimal, ideal socialist society. I find it fascinating, in fact, to meet a living member of the Utopian Socialist Guild. I thought most of them had died before the beginning of the century. But I'm afraid he does face the same problems that the early ones couldn't resolve. Namely, simple problems of how, in fact, in this society, there would be the delivery of the goods that people actually want, and democracy itself would survive. I don't think we had a complete answer to your question, in fact, about what was meant by overthrown. It still leaves open the question, if it is overthrown in the fashion that has been described through due democratic process, would that democratic process itself survive? Since there's implicit in what's been argued about the change in society, the possibility that it might not. So
Can we just take one or two of those points that you mentioned with Arthur Scargill straight away? First of all, how does your society deliver the goods that people actually want? And will democracy actually survive under the sort of structure that you've created?
I thought I made it perfectly plain in my lecture that it would first of all utilise the £14 billion wasted on unemployment and put that to use in investment in manufacturing goods for the benefit of people, and certainly investing in health and welfare rather than war. So it could deliver the goods, and certainly much more compassionately than a society which is merely motivated by the acquisition of profit. It would be motivated by people's needs, and that is the vital difference. Of course we would retain the democratic processes. In fact, the current government are eroding the democratic process. I want to see, for example, proportional representation, and fail to understand how any person who claims to be a Democrat can oppose it. And I'm no latter-day convert to proportional representation, because anyone who knows my history knows that from the age of 15, I've been a very passionate advocate of proportional representation. You cannot have an argument in favour of democracy without having an argument in favour of proportional representation, which secures a government elected by a majority of people. And that's why within my own trade union, no president can be elected unless it's by a majority. And I'm very pleased to say that 70.3% of my members elected me to office.
Patricia Hollis.
Well, unlike Professor Wiseman, I believe that Arthur Scargill's analysis is broadly right. Capitalism clearly is in a mess. It's been in that way, I think, pretty much since before the First World War. But unlike Arthur Scargill, I don't believe that capitalism will self-destruct, Trotsky notwithstanding, and I believe we will still have the mixed economy with us in 1997. What I think it will shape the future, what I think will determine whether that society is going to be a good one or whether it will be a brutal and unstable one, seems to me to depend on some of the points that Arthur has made, our commitment to social justice, the sharing, caring point that I think you're absolutely right to highlight, on our development of a social wage and dignity within work and autonomy within work, but also on something that I think Arthur didn't raise and I think we must draw attention to, which is the extent to which we have taken seriously as a country, as a nation, the Brandt Report, the North-South confrontation, world trade and world peace. I don't think we can face 1997 as an island economy, and I don't think that's either possible or ethical.
Dr. Hoyce, can we take him up on that straight away? Because we can come to your other points a little bit later on. You heard what Dr. Hoyce was worried about, that perhaps you were going to turn us into an island economy and not have the sort of internationalist approach which you so much believe in.
I think I said during the course of my lecture that internationalism would become synonymous with nationalism, and that was the whole concept that I was advancing, and therefore there would be no conflict whatsoever. I would regard myself as an internationalist, and certainly would argue very passionately that we should do all we can to assist the third world. I mean, I find it an absolute scandal that in 1982 we can witness the destruction of food in the European common market, or here in Britain, when we can see children die of starvation in the third world. That, in my view, represents obscenity. Secondly, can I take up 2 points that you raised? One, I didn't suggest that the system would self-destruct. I said that there were 2 alternatives. One that would inevitably lead to the creation of a socialist system of society, and the other, extremely sinister from my position, is that we could see the establishment, as we have in so many cases before, of a neo-fascist or fascist system of society, And we already see the beginnings of that by the anti-trade union legislation, by attacks on the democratic process, and by the eroding of normal social benefits. And so therefore, I think that there is a fundamental difference between arguing that it will self-destruct and suggesting that there are two alternative courses which in the current crisis, in my view, are inevitable, that you go one way or the other.
Robert Rose-James, what comments, general comments have you got to make on what Mr. Scargill has been saying?
I think the first point which really struck me was that much of this reminded me very much of the things being said in the late 1940s, when we had a socialist government in this country, when we had socialist governments pretty well in Europe and also to a lesser extent in the United States. And many of us were looking forward to an era which didn't actually occur. We're now in 1982, and it's a little bit easy for Mr. Scargill to flip rather quickly over the failures, which he admits, of certain socialist governments. Because I actually don't think we're talking about the problem of capitalism versus socialism in the world. I think we're talking about something very much more profound. And can I just take up one point? I was the person who initiated the Brandt Commission report when I was at the United Nations. I was involved in its preparation. I initiated it into the House of Commons. The whole point of the Brandt Commission report is the mutuality of interest between developing and developed countries. And the argument that you, Mr. Scargill, are putting forward for the siege economy is totally contrary to everything that we were working for in the Brandt Commission, and which, in my view, holds the future for a reasonable world economy. And if we're going to talk about the tide of history, I would respectfully say that at least you get some of it right. Because in the 1930s, for example, it was not the rearmament industry which restored the economy of this country. It was the motor car industry. Because it was capital intensive, it was labor intensive, and it was profitable. And if you're arguing that we went into that rearmament program to just create weapons of mass destruction, then of course that rather ignores the circumstances under which we had to do it. But I think there is fundamentally a dichotomy in your position, which I regard as serious, and I take you as a serious person. First of all, the division between nationalism and internationalism, and I do not think they're synonymous. I think they're totally contrary one to the other. But on the other hand, you're against the free market economy. You're totally against it. And yet in all your actions and your attitudes, you are strongly in favor of free collective bargaining. Now, where in this does the concept of the individual in society come into it? Where does the role of the central state as against the individual body, like a trade union, for example, come in? Because whether one's talking about Attlee-type socialism with a small c, or the small s and the very much larger kind that we have since, I think lies at the heart of what is a very serious dilemma and discussion. Because I'm not here, I think, to support totally every aspect of capitalism. You're not here to support every aspect of socialism. But your concept of socialism, British socialism, is, I would put, first of all, on a misreading of our history and our national character, and secondly, on a misunderstanding of our role in the world. And your decision and attitude to go out of the EEC, for example, is anti-internationalist and is disastrous for our economy.
Can we take up some of those points straight away with Arthur Scargill?
Yes, indeed. I think with respect, your analysis in assuming that we've had socialist governments is completely wrong. I submit that we've never had a socialist government in Britain. We've had Labour governments in Britain, but they've only practiced social democracy and have argued very passionately for the continuation of capitalism. And so therefore we've never had a socialist government. My argument is that we should have a complete alternative system. And to do that, we need a socialist government. Secondly, whether or not we agree about the conditions in the 1930s and early 40s which restored, if you want, full employment, is something we could debate all night. I seem to recall that we did have, even in the part of the world where I was born, the development of the war effort, re-establishing full employment, bearing in mind my own father was out of work for many, many years. Secondly, when you talk about free collective bargaining and it being in contradiction, with my views and my concept. I find this rather strange, because if we live in a totally unplanned society, I submit that you cannot plan one element of the productive process in isolation. What successive Labour and Conservative governments have tried to do is to introduce an incomes policy, either in a naked direct sense or in the current sense of an incomes policy by stealth with a cash limits policy. The net result has been the same. You only try to plan one element of the productive process, while all other elements, dividends and profits, and the purchase of the raw materials go totally unplanned. And I refute completely that in that situation the trade union movement have to have an incomes policy or a planned section of the economy which relates to wages. My argument is a simple one. While ever we live in a free market situation, we have no alternative as a trade union movement other than to press as hard as we can with the process of free collective bargaining for the best terms and conditions for our members, and in that way we can at least try to maintain our present position. Under a socialist system of society, I agree absolutely that we could certainly plan wages, we could plan the investment program, we could plan and control the management of our own affairs.
And have an incomes policy.
But of course that would be a socialist system.
Treasurer Hollis, I think you're anxious to say something.
Yes, I wanted to pick up the point about planning, if I may, because I wanted to press Arthur about the texture of his new society. I mean, he's given us clearly a fraternal and an egalitarian society. What I'd like to know is actually how libertarian it is. I mean, Beatrice Webb says socialists come into two categories, A's and B's, anarchists and bureaucrats. I'd like to know which side of that line Arthur is. There's a lot of emphasis on centralised planning. How much decentralisation will there be? How much personal space? How much variety of responses? How much scope for individual growth in Arthur's new world?
Well, I don't fall on either side of what Beatrice Webb said, because I don't agree with social democrats, actually. I believe in socialism. What I want to see is a developing system which guarantees, first of all, the liberty and democracy of our people, which will have both central planning and also allow planning in an area or on an area basis. And I see nothing wrong with that. I believe that we can do that adequately and well. For example, we could eliminate immediately much of the wastefulness that takes place within our existing system. We have a coal industry, a gas industry, we have an oil industry. All of them competing, all of them advertising their various products in competition with each other. That seems to me to be the height of stupidity. I would have thought that we would have one energy industry planning the energy resources of Britain so that we develop and expand each industry in a developing way so that we don't exploit one to the detriment of the other. So I would think that there is room for both, but at the centre of my argument, we would obviously have to retain full liberty and democracy. Otherwise, we would be very seriously in danger of drifting towards the East European system, which I don't agree with.
When you say full liberty, sorry, Jack Wiseman.
It seems to me it fits with some of the questions I asked earlier, to which I got totally unsatisfactory answers, in my view. To say you'll produce goods for the benefit of the people says nothing about how you'll find out what that benefit is. We need to know, is it your view of their benefit, in which case it's easy because they take what they're given, or is it their benefit, in which case we face the kind of problems that I'm talking about, in finding out what their benefits are, without reverting to a system in which they choose what to buy and people supply that. Second is the notion of need. It's an appealing word, a sympathetic word. But when you try to allocate goods to users by it, it's no help at all. It has no meaning. Unless you say you know what people's needs are, once again, and you will supply what you think their needs are. Now, all that does lead to a form of central plan, in which, far from the wishes of the citizens being respected, they have to be ignored to make the plan work. And that's why I ask, can you possibly envisage a system of democracy that could overthrow socialism after its first 10 years, when you're going to plan it centrally in this sort of fashion? And as a corollary to that, in this complete plan, with this organised energy sector, two questions. How would you know which mix of energy use would be most cost-effective for your society? I take it if you're going to do the best with your resources, you need to know that. How would you find out in your society? And just as a small, so to speak, addendum to that, clearly free collective bargaining would disappear because you said it's only necessary because such a society doesn't exist. How would miners' wages be determined?
Arthur Scargill, let's take that last one first. How would miners' wages be determined? Or how would a car worker's wages be determined?
Wages of workers, mine workers or any other section of the working class, would be determined on the basis of discussion within the central system.
Would they be allowed to strike?
And of course they would be allowed to strike. I think that any system that is established that removes the worker's right to withdraw his or her labour is anti-democratic and should not be tolerated. And that's why I condemn many of the East European states. I think I've made that perfectly clear.
What if they chose to strike about wages?
If they chose to strike about wages, that would be their legitimate right. And I can't accept that you can have a democratic system that then takes away democracy. So I do hope we can stop pursuing this argument. I do hope we can stop pursuing this argument because I've already explained about 3 times that I would accept total democracy, proportional representation, and workers' right to withdraw their labour.
But Mr.
When we talk about... No, you raised a number of points. When you raise the question about who would determine need, this is a fundamental question. Because you then made the point that people would supply on the basis of demand. Now, I submit to you that demand is not necessarily the best guide to people's needs. People's needs, in my view, and I think in the view of most people with an objective mind, would be for housing, would be for food, and the essentials of life. And if we provide those things, then I believe a society is a firm base. And if we have a government elected and supported on a programme which follows that pattern, then you have at the same time, firstly, the correct analysis of need because you've put it before the electorate, and secondly, a commitment and support from those who elected you. And so I don't think the question really is one of dispute.
Would you put before the electorate the alternatives that they sacrifice to get the standard of housing and other things that you determine they need?
I think that what we would put before the electorate is our programme, a programme that I've only been able to develop very briefly this evening, in the same way that Mrs. Thatcher only very briefly put before the electorate her programme.
But I thought you wouldn't like to be compared with her,
and received a minority vote. And of course, we've seen the disastrous consequences of her failing to respond to many of the promises that she made to the electorate.
Mr. Scargill, can I just... your Britain, your socialist Britain in the 1990s is going to be isolated, in my view bankrupt, and is going to be defenceless. Now, can I come to the last point first? You make, amongst many inaccurate remarks in your lecture, for example, you get the entire National Health Service offer entirely wrong, and I'm the only member of Parliament who's got a daughter who's a National Health Service nurse, so I happen to know about that. But you also talk about the vast expenditure on Trident. Trident is going to cost £25 a year per family in this country. And conventional weapons are immensely more expensive. So you're going to scrap Trident. You're going to scrap the nuclear deterrent. You're also, according to your program, going to scrap pretty well all our conventional weapons. So you have this isolated, non-European, in my view, bankrupt, defenceless Britain. How is that going to be a source of strength for your principles of socialism?
Certainly my society would be non-European. It would be a society that had a world vision, not a European vision. I think that the European common market, in fact, narrows our vision and isolates us, and certainly is the very opposite of internationalism. Secondly, when I talk about the defence budget, I advance the argument very powerfully that we could cut the arms bill by half. We could certainly eliminate the order for Trident weapons, bearing in mind that there is no defence against a nuclear attack, and if a world war starts with nuclear weapons, we would be obliterated as an island within a matter of minutes. There's no question about that.
The other side.
And therefore,
that helps a lot.
And therefore, we ought to recognise the logic of our position. And I suggest that it would be better not to spend £14 billion on arms and £7.5 billion on Trident, and put that money into the National Health Service, into things that matter, and above all, into developing industries in Britain so that we could get 4 million people who are out of work back to work and help improve the quality of our life. That, in my view, is sensible.
You do appreciate that at least half of the community would take the opposite view. They would rather forego palliatives to health, and as a contributor to the health of citizens, the health service is relatively minor compared with nutrition and other things, and there's good evidence about that. many people would say, if they felt they could deter the risk of death, that it was money better spent than spent on the health service. Certainly better than spent on miners' wages.
I must say, I have met very few people who share that view. I mean, if you talk to...
Well, perhaps we mix in different societies.
Can I make a point?
Satisfied from what you heard from Arthur Scargill that
Chamberlain,
people will have enough space to move in his society that it will be libertarian enough?
I believe that, as indeed Arthur himself has said, that he is a Democrat. And given that, I'm quite sure that his model of the new society will reflect people's needs and aspirations. And I don't make the distinction that Professor Wiseman is doing between those needs and aspirations. I mean, just look around you, just ask people what their priorities are. And it's about homes, it's about jobs, it's about schools, it's about health, you know, access to the health service. And it's about fear of a bomb and fear of cruise missiles. And these are the real fears. I mean, we have created a fearful society.
Do you accept the need for central planning and that kind of thing?
I'm rather more bothered about that, I must say, because Arthur's version of socialism seems to me to rely too much on tough, centralised planning measures which presume single solutions, unilateral solutions, and I'm rather more sceptical about these. I think there's much more sort of regional variety, much more need for pluralism, perhaps, than has come out in Arthur's lecture tonight.
But the fundamental problem comes back to this, that all that Mr. Scargill has been talking about, and all that Dr. Hollis is talking about, is the distribution of wealth. There is no thought whatever given how that wealth is going to be created, how people are going to have the incentive to create that wealth, how we are going to continue as a country which, although rich, is not nearly as rich as it once was. This whole discussion reminds me very much of the discussions I used to have many, many years ago, and of which Tony Crosland's book was perhaps the high watermark. Yes. In other words, how do we get rid of our wealth and make a more fair society? And it's a perfectly valid question. I absolutely accept that. But never is question given to the absolutely fundamental point, how do we create the wealth in order to do it?
I find the question rather perplexing, and I'll explain why. It is surely more common sense to produce motor cars, to produce tractors, to develop our agricultural system, rather than to produce tanks and bombs and aeroplanes, because at least you've got something tangible at the end of the development program. And therefore, I put it to you that if we had to adopt a sensible policy and we had to invest in basic industries, get rid of the 4.5 million unemployed, put them back to work, help create wealth, and in the process produce a more compassionate and caring system of society. That, to me, seems to be common sense.
Arthur Scargill, can we look at some of the institutions in your new socialist society? First of all, what happens to Parliament? Is it freely elected as it is today?
I would argue that Parliament would be freely elected, but there would be one change in the process. It would be elected by proportional representation.
Yes, right.
And I find it's astonishing that other people in the Labour Party don't agree with me.
And there will be opposition parties, of course, in the usual way?
Well, of course there would be opposition parties. But I would just put one point to all.
You make the assumption the socialist state, once it's created, it'll be there to stay forever.
I would just put one point to you. I think that politically it would be accepted by most political scientists that a political party represents a class, and the class is determined by its relationship to the means of production. If you eliminate, and I don't mean in a physical way of overthrow, let's get that clear. If you eliminate an owning and ruling class, then you eliminate much of the opposition that would naturally be there within a capitalist system. If you have a socialist system of society, all the possibilities are there for people to express their opposition to policies. And there could, of course, be different political parties, but I firmly believe that these would disappear in time. And could I use as evidence of this the trade union movement? We have in the British trade union movement widely differing views. You couldn't get more differing views than Lord Gormley and Arthur Scargill, and yet we both existed within the same trade union, expressing those views very passionately and certainly loudly on television screens and on radio.
What would happen to the armed services of the police, the two great nationalised industries, as you call them in your lecture?
The two nationalised industries that I referred to in my lecture would be then democratically accountable. First of all, I would make it available to both the police and the armed forces to belong to trade unions. Secondly, I would ensure that at local level there was an accountability so that the elected representatives had some direct control over these people, which at the present time they have not. If we're talking about democracy, then let us mean what we say, because if we don't, then we're only tinkering with democracy.
Who does the accounting in your society? You talk about accountability, but who does it?
The accountability must inevitably be done by the only force of people that can, and that's the people who have elected the government. If you don't have inbuilt within the system the opportunity for people to recall at any time those which they have elected to power, then you haven't got the system that I want, and you haven't got democracy.
Robert Rhodes James, we've heard a vision of the 1997s as seen by Arthur Scargill, the perfect socialist state. How do you see 1997?
It's always very dangerous and difficult to look into the future. When one looks at the prognostications made in the past, maybe the last 100 years, things haven't worked out anything like the experts thought. I'm bound to say I wouldn't very much care to live in Mr. Scargill's socialist Britain, although I'm riveted by his sudden adherence to proportional representation, which I've supported for some time. I'd be interested to know which particular kind
Do you
of
see a mixed economy still existing in 1997?
I would like to see the mixed economy and the role of the individual and the present system of democracy in this country remaining. And I would like this country still to be free and independent, but also still very strongly internationalist.
Patricia Hollis.
I hope, though I don't entirely believe we will have, I hope we do indeed have a socialist society. But my socialist society, I think, will be more decentralised, more based on local communities, more various, more diverse, possibly, than Arthur Scargill's, but one in which the sharing, caring, compassion, commitment is there to the full, in which people can grow tall, grow strong. I hope we have that sort of society.
Jack Wiseman, in the 1990s, from your point of view?
Well, an old senior professor and good friend of mine told me that there were only two forecasts an economist should make. One for next year, because most things are built in, and one for a period longer than his life expectancy, because then he can't be held answerable. So in principle, I don't want to answer your question. But
will capitalism, for example, in your view, still be alive and well in the 1990s?
Well, how well it'll be, I don't know, because I think what we face is something quite different from what Arthur Scargill does. I think we're in the middle of a serious problem of social transition all over the world. There is one problem that's absolutely general, and there's another that I think is fairly specific to Britain. The first one is a technological revolution that, in my view, is of the same proportions as the Industrial Revolution. And social institutions, by their nature, adapt much more slowly than do technical ones. And we are in the midst of an attempt to adapt to that sort of a situation, which is why the unemployment that we're suffering all over the world, in my view, is not going to turn out to be cyclical. People are right when they say it'll last, but they haven't got the reasons right. They've got it, the reason it's going to last is because it's going to take a lot of time to sort out how to deal with it. And in that transition, there is going to be pain, there is going to be trouble, because the adjustment is going to be very difficult, and we don't know how to do it. And there will be people, just as in the first Industrial Revolution, who see only the warts and not the face.
Professor Wiseman, Arthur Scargill, Patricia Hollis and Robert Rhodes James, thank you all very much indeed. Well, in Futures next week, Clive Sinclair, the electronics millionaire and innovator of the cheap computer and the 2-inch television screen, will present his view of the 90s, a Britain with virtually no one working in manufacturing industry. Until then, good night.